How is Philadelphia responding to the many crises of 2020? Right now, we'll have a conversation. Hey, I'm Chris Swink. I'm the publisher of Generocity. I'm joined by my colleague, Sabrina Vourvoulias, Generocity editor, and Lynette Hazelton, who's leading some reporting for us at Generocity on this year of recovery. Hey, guys, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Chris.
Of course. Of course. So Project Trace, this is something that Sabrina and Lynette, you guys are leading. You're doing weekly reporting on philanthropy and the private sector and government and civic leaders generally, how we are responding to the myriad of challenges of 2020, a health crisis, an economic crisis, a conversation on racial equity. So I think we got to at least start. We're a couple months into your reporting. Level set. What are we optimistic about? What are we pessimistic about? Could we start there?
Sure. I'm going to jump in with the pessimism first. Of course.
Right.
One of the things that really has struck me, in particular with one of Lynette's most recent stories, is that in terms of the COVID relief philanthropy, she reports that 60% of the funds have gone to Philadelphia-based nonprofits in the form of one-time grants. And the average size of those grants is just $8,211. And that is ridiculously low. I can't imagine what the nonprofits are going to be able to afford by it.
And just to intercede, that I'd imagine we think that average comes from a whole lot of really small micro grants. We knew a lot of community foundations and others were trying to get money out fast, quickly. Your fear, though, is that that's not scaling up, and we're trying to handle a cut off arm and amputation with a few Band-Aids.
Yes, well, foundations themselves have said that one of the things that they're willing to do is to do multi-year support because it will lend a sense of stability to nonprofits. And the fact that the amount is so low is worrisome.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's pessimism. Do we have any optimism in the early, the speed of our response and the level of it is what's worrisome? Anything we're optimistic about?
So it is difficult.
Lynette, you'll be our optimistic one.
Yeah, it's difficult to find, slivers of gold in this story. But one of the things I did was a article, and it included talking about the food banks and the amount of support that poured in. So as people found out about the problems with the pandemic was setting up, and you did get support coming in. Now that was a bit of optimism. It's what happens after a disaster. And of course, the optimism quickly becomes pessimism because without maintaining visibility, the purses close, and that's what the food banks are concerned about right now. But the need still escalates. But people do give in a disaster.
Right. Yeah, this idea that we have a hurricane-like disaster, but when it's prolonged over such a period of time, our folks are just going to shut down. Like maybe some reporting that we've done, both Sister Site technically, but also Generosity. I think any criticism of the federal government's CARES Act, including the Paycheck Protection Program, and there are myriad criticisms of them, almost misses the point. It's like it was a fine sandwich, but we had a nationwide hunger issue. And for me, it's not quite right to say the sandwich was rotten. It just was like, this is just such a bigger reality, like an economic shock built on a health crisis that's ongoing, built on centuries of racial inequality. Yeah, it's not going to be solved with a single bill. So the takeaway I guess you guys given me is like, sure, there was some quick stuff, but we haven't yet seen a lot of the big stuff. That's fair.
I am heartened because by the response of foundations, though. I do think that they've been examining how they give and what they can do. And some of them, like Scattergood, for example, really has sort of a checklist that is a disaster checklist, really it through which they're working. So that's heartening to me.
And foundations are questioning that 5% that they give. Should they
Right.
only give 5% at this point? And that came out with the Dowdy Foundation when I did an article with them. And, they are questioning those sorts of things. I think okay, so to reverse roles for a little bit and be the pessimist, um, a foundation cannot replace the government. And one of the articles I did on the mass evictions that are expected to come as the moratoriums went away is they cannot be replaced by a foundation. Um,
Mhm.
we cannot house people on grants.
Mhm.
So Debbie Downer moment, I guess, but it's
What, I mean, you're getting at a big issue that we're seeing in a whole lot of our reporting, which we our federalism, like it or not, over the last couple decades, has turned to an increasingly hesitant or herky-jerky federal government response, which has meant local and state governments are increasingly expected to handle macro issues, um, and philanthropy and private sector. Tavoni DeVore, shout out to a frequent Generocity columnist and an Urban Affairs Coalition teammate. I've heard him often point that is perhaps every nonprofit a government policy failure. That theoretically every nonprofit is trying to fill a gap that an expansionist view of government would say should be solved, and that of course is a political issue. But all right, so let's actually turn to a bit of data here. We're releasing today. Generosity did a self-assessment with 50 plus regional leaders of how they themselves would both view their individual organizational responses and the region. So this is meant to be philanthropy, private sector, government sector. I mean, it's meant to be all encompassing, not pointing it on one person. And we basically went through 12 or so topic areas and asked them to self-assess on a scale of 1 to 5. How is the region responding? And on generosity.org, you can find the full results and narrative coming out. But for Lynette and Sabrina, I want to call out a couple things that I saw, both on what folks thought that we did okay on and what is not going well, and kind of get your reaction to see if your reporting ties to it. So what's working? Basically, again, 1 to 5 scale. So what got 3.5 or 4.0 out of 5 and above? Only 2 places of a dozen. The region did feel like we've done a reasonably good job in responding to the pandemic, the health crisis itself. This is both health infrastructure, and I suppose a collective sense of like getting your masks on. Right now, recording this in October 2020, Pennsylvania's again seeing rises statewide, so we might eat those words. But at the moment, the region has felt okay about that. And incorporating racial equity in a stakeholder effort. So this was meant to be seen not the deepest of racial equity issues, but the concept of making sure race and racial equity is at the forefront of conversations and topics. So these 2 ways the region felt like we've done okay. Lynette, Sabrina, your reporting, is this in tune with what you've seen?
I think that's accurate. I think that there is at least the focus on looking at racial equity within a variety of different issues or concerns that may not have been there before. It feels a little surface to me, at least in part because, for example, the responses that have really made a difference seem to have been small individual or community-centered responses. So, for example, the consortium of Black doctors that realized that that no Black community wasn't being tested, and they came together themselves to go out and offer testing in neighborhoods. That's admirable and amazing effort. But it was an effort of the stakeholders themselves, really, to address things.
Mm.
Yeah, I would agree. Um, I do think that from the pandemic point of view, I think the fact that there's not a lot of uh, 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 problems between Wolf and Kinney and the Department of Health here, that they speak with a singular voice pretty much has been helpful versus on the federal level. So,
Governor Tom Wolf, Philadelphia Mayor Jim Kenney. Yeah, you're making that point that I guess if we're forced to count our blessings, know that there are states where there are active litigation between city mayors and governors about whether we should be forcing masks. So, in the spirit of calling out what is working, we are not fighting about whether masks should be worn, at least in an institutional sense.
yes, and at least as you pointed out in October 2020. But
Right.
on the other hand, I agree with Sabrina that the stakeholder, while I'm glad that it's working, it does seem a bit surface. And yes, the Black Doctors Consortium is a great example of someone who had to go to GoFundMe to get money to do something that seems to me to be very common sense. Take the testing to the people,
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
it was good.
So, all right, let's. So that's the good stuff. Let's look again at numbers on what's not. So this is the same self-assessment, 50 plus leaders of large-scale nonprofits. These are city agency leaders. These are community-based nonprofits and some private sector voices. What's not working? We asked them a dozen or so questions. And what got the lowest marks? A few things. A whole bunch in the middle. But what got the lowest marks? Our response to police reform. Obviously, after the first wave of the health crisis in the United States, after the first wave of the economic shock, we saw the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which sparked on. After a whole range of important work, this sparked nationwide protests, which still carry on. And then this showed so much racial inequality that police reform became a very central issue of this. Among the issues we're meant to respond to, this got the lowest marks of our self-assessment, a 2 on a 5 scale from our regional leaders. Saw very limited. Although I will say some of those responses came before some news this week, so we can talk perhaps about that. Addressing chronic issues. So this is meant to mean existing issues, homelessness, addiction, how that isn't being incorporated and responded to in this year. And small biz relief, a pretty straightforward one. Although Lynette, you've pointed that a lot of relative money went to small business relief, but interestingly, this got the third lowest marks of the dozen. So, Sabrina, Lynette, maybe talk to me a little bit about what stands out to you for these being our lowest marks from our regional leaders self-assessing.
I think undoubtedly the addressing chronic issues is one that we knew was going to be problematic. So in terms of much of our response to homelessness is to at least initially put people into congregate shelters, which is, of course, completely contraindicated in COVID. And I think that some of the issues that we saw in terms of people camping out encampments on the parkway and so forth really drew attention to how inadequate that aggregate or congregate shelter system is. Also, I just feel, for example, that the Latino community, which is one of, you know, very poor community in Philadelphia, has been pretty much has felt like they've been neglected. No attention has been paid to them, and that seems to me a chronic um, issue in terms of, you know, access to healthcare, access to services, and so forth. Though I'm going to, you know, jump in with one positive. The city did start very quickly, did respond very quickly to complaints that COVID information was not being released in Spanish. They have been very good about that since the initial response.
Mm.
Yeah. So, so police reform. I was surprised that it went internationally, but I think when you are staring at something as horrendous as a man being allegedly murdered, do I have to say allegedly murdered?
You're an individual, Annette. You can say whatever you feel.
I just think
We can do a whole other episode about journalists using the word allegedly. That's for a graduate course in journalism we'll teach later.
It was just too much to bear. I just think that it was internationally, people said enough. And so from that point of view, the police are now, and policing, I should say, is under the microscope. And it needs to be under the microscope because I do think Black and brown communities are policed more than they're protected. And and it's taken me a long time to say that I'm a pretty even keeled person. And so I'm glad that we're looking at that, but what will it mean? However, chronic issues, in doing this reporting, I wonder how long will it take for there to be a recovery? You know that the people were just beginning to recover from the Great Recession. They talked about a jobless recovery, which is an oxymoron to me. I don't understand how you recover and be jobless at the same time. So this is so much worse. Philadelphia, which is already poor, is going to be devastated, I think. And I know that's a very negative way to, end my response, but we have to maybe we can take an opportunity to look very seriously at our economic holistically, you know.
I mean, a quick question to the two of you, man, I'd be interested in your perspectives. The Voting Rights Act of 1964 didn't happen in a year or 6 months. You could say it was years of movement. And generally review in terms of factual wealth gap closing in the 60s and some policy initiatives, we saw a pretty rapid rate of change for the mid-60s. And then 1970 came, and for the next 50 years, 1970 to 2020, we saw next to no additional gains. That effort was very concentrated in a brief period of time. Do either of you feel optimistic about we're in the midst of another rapid period of positive change? Or pessimistic?
That's a good question, Christopher. I think there will be some change for those folks who are able to take advantage of it. In the 60s, the change really did benefit a middle class population of people and people who had gone to school. And so it did benefit it before the door slammed shut, as I said. And I do think that will happen. My concern is those that are poor, those that are under-credentialed, those who are not ready for the economy. Are we going to be able to bring them along and not forget um, those folks. Because, like you said, and that's not just Black and brown people. That's also white males who did not have a high school diploma, or maybe just a high school diploma, and could have made a good living, but the economy changed. And then in 2016, of course, they formed a real coalition for Trump. Um, we need in this country to look at how to make sure people are surviving, because if they don't thrive, I mean, not just survive, but survive, you're going to have a whole bunch of chronic illness and chronic issues. I'm sorry.
I'm guardedly optimistic. I really do feel like a lot of the discourse has really changed, and it may only be surface level. I mean, I think one of the criticisms I've heard is that you know, the response that, at least initially, for defunding the police, or allocating funds differently, really represented a shuffling around of funding and responsibilities, as opposed to any genuine change. But I think that the genuine change is in the fact that um, it's almost impossible to have a conversation about issues without understanding the history of racial injustice that undergirds it. And I think that conversation is significantly different than it has been. So it makes me guardedly optimistic.
So we're over time here, but I want to maybe touch on a final point, and this is a framing that Lynette actually armed me with. You'd say, even looking back at the Great Recession, there is a period of continued falling, and then you climb out. Whether you look at number of jobs created, wealth creation, even policy progress or cultural change, you have a collapse, you have a fall and a rise, relief and a recovery, as Lynette, you've put it. So we went through pandemic, still ongoing, economic shock. We might be out of a recession, technically speaking, but how a lot of people feel might be different. Conversation on racial equity. I mean, setting aside election, hurricanes, wildfires, sitting here in October 2020, are we yet into the relief? Are we yet into the recovery, or are we still on the fall? Are we still, where are we in that? Oh, you're muted. Yeah, there you go. Sorry, Lynette.
Okay, that's a good question, and it's a question that I wanted to look at this week for an article. So I actually, sent out an email blast to some of the people that we've been interviewing through the Trace Project, and I asked them that question: are we in relief, or are we in recovery, or and what's normal going to be? And the answers, I'm not finished getting answers yet, but what's coming back is we are still very much in relief. Is what I'm seeing. That and one person wrote me and said, "What will normal be when I don't see us giving out food boxes, when there's food boxes left over, And so I think so far in my very unscientific survey, this is still in the beginning stages of relief."
I like that final idea of you should check in and make sure you do when you can say, in fact, that said organization gave out their food box. Not saying we'll solve perhaps hunger, but perhaps they feel like core services can handle that, as opposed to the much more expansionist efforts. All right, that is it. That's our time here. So my name is Chris Wink. I'm the publisher of Generocity, joined by Sabrina and Lynette. Please check out the link, generosity.org/project/trace, to see all the work that Lynette's doing with Sabrina's support. We'll keep reporting on this recovery of 2020, and we'll check in the future. I certainly appreciate you guys checking us out. See ya.